Hello, everyone. It's been it's been a little while, maybe a week or two. I just wanted to give you a sort of a recap of lesson 11, which was water. Um, Everyone did pretty well, I would say, overall. A couple of highlights to hit that might help you for the exam. Number one, remember that the most important, um, you know, water conservation approach. It's not, unfortunately, it's not domestic water use. So anything you use at home, which it's good to conserve and use less at home. So taking shorter showers and not letting the water run and all that sort of thing. That's helpful um, because every drop counts, no pun intended. But the more important thing, remember, domestic use is only about 8 to 10% of total freshwater use. And so if we really want to address the water problem and conserve water, we need to address things like agriculture, which is something like 50 or 60%. And actually power use, as it turns out, power plants use a lot of water to cool the cooling in the cooling towers. Okay, so if you've ever noticed, power plants are always located next to bodies of water, whether it's a lake or like the Salem nuclear power plant down on it's actually on the other side of the Delaware Bay on New Jersey. If you're going north or south on Route 1 in Delaware, you see that big power plant. There's always some smoke coming out of it. Well, that smoke is all vapor. It's water vapor, and that's cooling down that cooling tower, which has to stay cool enough, otherwise it's going to melt. So anyway, that's a major user. So if we want to address water scarcity, the important thing we can do is eat less meat, frankly, but also try to convert to more water, conserving less water intensive crops, use less energy, but also saving energy at home or saving water at home is also important. It's an interesting discussion regarding water as a human right. So the United Nations has declared water as a human right. There was that question about treating water as a right versus a commodity. And as a right, it's important because that means everybody should have access to it, and you should find ways to provide it to people. So that's more equitable. It does tend to lead to overuse and waste because people don't treat it as it's not as valuable if they're not paying money for it. And that's the flip side. If it's a commodity, and as most of you correctly described, you're probably going to use less water because it costs money. But the big drawback is then if you can't afford it, you don't have it. And water, we need water to live. So like if you deny someone with water, you could literally kill them. And that has and continues to happen. So it's really an interesting sort of needle to thread. Like, do we treat it as a right, but if we commodify it, then we can kind of use it more efficiently. So if you kind of try to find that middle ground is probably the best bet there. Hopefully you all had a chance to sort of read a little bit and watch a video about Cochabamba, Bolivia. That's this sort of very infamous event in water management history. But versions of that happen all over the place, and the real takeaway from that is not only the sort of overall sustainability aspect of it, but really to think about privatization and what that does to any resource. Okay, so, and privatization is just taking something that was publicly owned, a public good, and putting it into private hands. So selling it to, it could be an individual or a corporation, it doesn't matter. So someone owns it as opposed to the public owning it. And water supplies are often public goods. So, you have your sort of like municipal water supply, and they're often publicly owned. So when you privatize, it's very similar to the commodification issue that we just discussed. If you privatize it, the cost tends to go up, which people tend to use less. And then you have a business that their business model is based on conserving water and using it efficiently. So the more efficiently they use the water, the more profit they're going to get. And so they tend to find ways to reduce water use and conserve and so forth. However, as you saw in Cochabamba, which is very typical of privatization, the price goes up, and that means people that before could afford it can't afford it. And then water, again, being a major thing in terms of like everything, right? So everything from eating to washing to, if you're growing food, whatever. So it's really important. And then if it's too expensive, people can't afford it, then that puts them in dire straits, and it's not really helpful to them that it's commodified. And so that privatization process is pretty common. And it happens, as you saw in the smaller scale, like up in Pennsylvania in that article. But it's still, I still hear news about water supplies and so forth being privatized in the U.S. and elsewhere. So it is a major issue to consider. If there's money to be made, people are going to try to make money. And the problem is, if you're making money on a commodity that's essential for life, if people can't afford it, if people can't afford, I don't know, organic food, let's say, they can still get food, and they'll be okay. If people can't afford water, they're toast. Like you need water. So it's a really difficult sort of balance to strike. And these are really important issues that are still debated at a bunch of different scales. The last thing I wanted to discuss briefly, there's that question there about terrorism and how using systems thinking to address terrorism. I think it's important to consider that sort of phenomenon where we see these issues that pop up that are largely a result of people being desperate, right? Terrorism is a great example of that. Contrary to popular belief, terrorism is not because people hate America or hate whatever country they're doing these acts in. Now there's some of that, but by and large, you're not going to be able to foment that type of hate if people are okay in their life, if they have enough money and food and shelter and clothing and so forth. Okay, so most of that's done out of desperation. Now there are of course bad actors across the world, and we need to take care of them as necessary. But it's better to get at the root of the problem, and then it's double. There's two good benefits. Number one, you're helping people, and number two, you don't have to worry about going out and hunting terrorists and spending all this money on defense spending and so forth. You could say the same thing about crime, domestic crime, which is an issue. And there are bad actors out there, but a lot of crime is done out of desperation. And so if we can address that, make sure that people have enough, all the stuff we talked about, quality of life and equity considerations, if we can try to do that, provide education and health care and decent wages and clean environments, clean air, treat them fairly, make sure they have their full rights. If we can do that, we will minimize crime rates, and then crime doesn't become such a problem. Then we don't have to spend so much money on it and so forth. Now, of course, the world's a complex place, so there are very wealthy and influential corporations and other interested parties that make a lot of money off of things like war and crime and so forth. I mean, look at the private prison issue. Look at what's going on in Ukraine right now. You have some war profiteers making a bunch of money off of that. So they won't admit it openly, but they love conflicts like this. And so there are parties that sort of prevent us from really addressing the source because they wouldn't benefit from it. All of this is just to say that these are systems-based problems, and you really have, if you want to address a symptom of one of these problems, like crime, like terrorism, like hunger, like poverty, you need to look at it from a systems perspective. That's kind of really the point of that, and hopefully the take-home that you get. Okay, well that's it for the water lesson. I'll follow up with lesson 12. Hopefully this was helpful.